Thank you for joining us. The Columbian Editorial Board is pleased to welcome candidate Wendy Smith for Vancouver Public Schools Board of Directors, position 3. We have invited the challenger in this race, Jorge Bailey, and he had confirmed that this time would work for him, but he has not made it, so hopefully we'll catch up with him later. But we're happy that you could join us. I'm Greg Jane, the editorial page editor, and I'll let the members of the editorial board introduce themselves. Ben?
Ben Campbell, I'm the publisher of the Columbian.
And Scott?
Scott Campbell's my name. I am the recently retired publisher of the Columbian, and currently chairman of the board.
And Craig.
I'm Craig Brown, I'm the editor of the Columbian, and Griffin Riley, our education reporter, may or may not be joining us depending on how it goes with his computer here in the next few minutes.
Okay, so let's say, and as mentioned previously, we are recording this. We will post it unedited on our website. So with that, we'll get started. Wendy, take 1 to 2 minutes to introduce yourself, explain why you are running, and then we'll get into some specific topics related to the school board. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, so as you know, my name is Wendy Smith. I currently serve on the Vancouver School Board in position 3, so I'm running for re-election. I am a lifelong resident of the district. I've lived here my whole life. I attended Vancouver schools kindergarten through 12th grade. I graduated from Columbia River High School, and I am the parent now of 2 Vancouver students. I have my son is in 3rd grade, and my daughter is a 7th grader, which is really hard for me to believe that she's a middle schooler. I am also the parent of a student with special needs. So I bring that perspective to the board. I am an educator with 20 years experience working in public schools. This is my 18th year as a classroom teacher. I teach at Heritage High School in the Evergreen District. I teach social studies, civics, and US history. And I worked as a classified staff for a couple of years before I became a teacher. I believe very strongly in representative government. That's why I'm a civics teacher. It is a core value of mine. And so I have been privileged to represent this community on the board for the last almost 4 years. And I'm eager to continue that service. I am also, at this point, the longest serving board director. We've had a lot of changes in our district in the last few years. So one thing that I also bring to the board, for whatever value you might want to place on it, is some continuity over the last few years. We've had, in my time on the board, 6 new board directors have come on. Some have come and some have gone. And we also have a new superintendent. So there's been a lot of changes. So that is one thing that I also bring to the board, is just that sense of continuity, a little bit of connection to the work previous to this current board. I think that's it.
Okay, great, thank you. And let's talk about, you mentioned a lot of turnover on the board the past couple of years, a new superintendent. How does the board work to reinforce trust in the community with so many changes?
I think that, in all honesty, I think that some of those changes have reinforced trust. I mentioned 6 new board directors. Well, 3 of them were elected, right, all at once, and that definitely changed and the dynamic of the board and a little bit of the direction of the board. But those were people who our constituents, our community, invested their trust in those 3 board directors. They invested their trust in me when they elected me as well. So I think that I think this board has done a good job in building trust with our community. It's a board that is very committed to transparency, open communication. We are eager to get lots of feedback from our community and all the different stakeholders that make up our community. So we're I sometimes wonder if maybe we're being annoying by asking for so much feedback, but we're constantly seeking ideas and feelings and thoughts on the things that we're doing and trying to inform our work so that we are truly representative of our community.
And you mentioned in getting feedback, obviously in some cases it's been a contentious year given school responses to COVID, et cetera. And some parents, I've heard say that they don't feel they're being listened to. Do you think that's accurate, or does that just mean they aren't getting the answers they want, but they are being heard?
Oh, absolutely. We listen to every every perspective. I think that, like you said, some parents may feel that way. I think that's probably more, the reality is more that the answers that they're seeking are not forthcoming. If you're talking about, and this could be a number of topics, but if, for example, if you're talking about mask mandates, right, the requirement for students to wear masks in the classroom, there are a handful of parents who don't care for that mandate. The reality is that's not a decision that's made at the board level, and they're feeling frustrated by that. However, I will tell you that the feedback that we have received overwhelmingly shows strong support from our parents and families for having students wear masks. So I think there are some people who feel like they're not being heard, but really what's really happening is they're not the majority opinion. And as representatives, we need to listen to all of those perspectives and use all of those perspectives to inform the decisions that we make. But ultimately, we need to represent the will of the community. And the support of this community is for masks in classrooms.
Now, when it comes to mask mandates, does the board have any say, or is that handed down from the state level?
In Washington State, that was a decision made by the governor. But I mean, I can't speak for my other board directors because it's not something that we've ever really discussed, but I'll be honest, like I support masks in classrooms as a teacher and as a parent. And so, and I know from many conversations and many emails, so many emails, that the majority of our parents support that as well. So even without that mandate from the governor, I feel confident that Vancouver would have taken that step anyway, because that's clearly what our community wants.
Okay, thank you. Craig?
Sure. So you shared a lot of in-depth information with us about your thoughts about diversity and inclusion in schools and what the school district's role is in that. I'm wondering if you can kind of summarize that for us.
Sure. So the district has been working for well over a year now on an equity initiative and looking at taking steps to identify inequities in our system and figuring out some solutions for how can we address those inequities and make our district as equitable as possible. That's always been a goal of Vancouver's, is to increase equity. But we took some, I think, some really meaningful steps in the last year by conducting an equity audit. And now we are going through the results of that equity audit and using that to draft some policy language. So we are now in the process. The steps that we're in is looking at the kind of the first draft of that equity policy, and again soliciting feedback from our community about whether or not it is reflective of the community's values and desires. And that'll be that's a process that will take several months actually, because we're kind of building kind of a constant feedback loop, right? So here's the draft policy, soliciting feedback, and we're actually having a town hall next week to get some of that feedback from our community, and then revising, making a second draft, making a third draft, and then soliciting more feedback so that we are sure that the equity policy matches the desires of our community. So that's where we're at right now.
Now, regarding that, what would you say to critics who believe that schools should just focus on the basics of education and that stuff such as equity takes away from that basic mission?
I think maybe we could have a valuable conversation about what constitutes the basics of education. I think often you'll hear reading, writing, and math, kind of being the 3 R's, the basics of education. I'm going to be honest, that's a very old-fashioned way of seeing education. There's way more than just reading, writing, and math skills. And I think that our community has shown again and again that they're looking for more than just those basics. But I would also challenge someone who might say that just because some students are able to find success at those handful of skills, all students are. And that's where the equity policy comes, right? So making sure that every one of our students has access and opportunities so that they can be successful with every facet of their education, not just the basics.
Well, I think that that's something that your opponent, Mr. Bailey, said in the voters pamphlet. He said, let us return to teaching the basics. And he also said, we are failing our children, which seemed to me like a very strong statement. Is the Vancouver School District failing their children?
No, not at all. Not at all. When my husband and I decided where to raise our children, there was no question. It was Vancouver. If I felt like Vancouver was failing our children, I would not be raising my children here. No, we are not failing our kids, but we are looking beyond just reading, writing, and arithmetic. And there's so much more to education beyond those basics. And I will also say, and I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth. Mr. Bailey's not here to speak for himself, but he has mentioned in other forums, looking at the SBAC scores. I'm assuming those are the numbers he refers to as being indicative of us failing somehow. But again, that connects back to our equity work, because if you disaggregate those test scores, you're going to see some huge achievement gaps among not just our students of color, but our students with learning disabilities, our students living in poverty. And so those, if you just look at a single number, it is not reflective at all of what's really happening in the district and the challenges that our students face and the ways that we can help them.
And I would like to mention, and again, I wish that Mr. Bailey were here to comment on this. On his campaign's Facebook page, he said the NEA, the National Education Association, is hell-bent on teaching racism, sexism, and many more brainwashing topics. How would you respond to that, Wendy?
Honestly, it's just such an absurd thing to say that I don't really know how to respond to it. And I think that someone who's kind of got that line of thinking is probably not going to be very receptive to the reality. Nobody is teaching sexism or racism. I mean, who would honestly take active steps to teach that? We have a lot of people who believe that our work towards our equity policy, our work towards our equity initiative is somehow teaching racism. Or I have heard, and again, I'm not putting words in Mr. Bailey's mouth because this is not something I've heard from him, but from other people who have spoke at our school board meetings, for example, that we're somehow teaching, white children to hate themselves, or some sort of reverse racism, which is just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. Nobody is doing that. But we do need to teach our students actual true history. We do need to be honest with the history of the United States, and racism is part of that history. So to somehow pretend that teaching honest history is teaching racism is just ridiculous. It's absurd. Or sexism or any of the other claims.
And is critical race theory being taught in Vancouver schools?
No, it's not being taught in Vancouver schools. And I would say that it's not appropriate to be taught in Vancouver schools, not because there's anything wrong with critical race theory, or I don't believe there's anything wrong with critical race theory. In fact, I think as a society, we're having lots of conversations around that idea of systemic racism. But that is a college level academic concept that frankly, our K through 12 students are just not intellectually ready for. So to be teaching critical race theory, I mean, that's graduate level, right? Thinking, and our students aren't there. They will be someday, but they're not there right now. So we have a lot of people who are very confused about what critical race theory is. They equate, say, culturally responsive teaching, also CRT, but not at all the same thing.
Let's see. There's Wendy. There we go.
I apologize. My Wi-Fi just cut out, and I've never.
That's okay. Well, Wendy, we're joined by Griffin Riley, reporter at the Columbian. He will not be asking questions in this form, but might want to speak with you later. And anything, as far as the video feed going out, the other time that happened was with Governor Inslee, so don't feel guilty about it.
Good company.
Anyway, so I forget where we were, but I think we'll move on to the next question. Let's see. Overall, you mentioned you're in favor of mask mandates. But again, that was handed down from the state. So the board does not have a say on that. But overall, how would you assess the district's response to COVID, both as far as education and financially?
Right. I think that I'm quite proud of the work that we did during the pandemic. It's a different measurement tool that you use to determine success or not success. It certainly was not the same quality that we traditionally will provide students in terms of the quality of education. We did the very best that we could in an impossible situation. I think one of the things that I'm proud of with regards to the district is that we pivoted just as quickly as we could to remote learning in the spring of 2020. One of the things that we say very often in education is we equate things to building the airplane as you're flying it, right? Like trying to fly the airplane as you're building it. I mean, and that was very much true during the pandemic. When we shut down in March of 2020, originally, we were thinking 3 weeks, and then it was 6 weeks, and then it was who knows, and we had to figure out, never really knowing for how long are we going to have to do this. It was just impossible. And it wasn't just Vancouver, it was every school district. Every school district was in the same boat. But I feel like we were able to pivot very quickly to remote learning. Was it as good? No, it wasn't. If it was as good, we'd still be doing it, right? It's cheaper, but it wasn't as good, which is why we were so happy to be back in person. But it was still better than nothing. And I feel for the situation we were in, we did it very well, frankly. Our teachers are incredibly talented. I am a parent, so I was on the receiving end, or I saw what my children were receiving from their teachers. And all things considered, I feel very good about the education they received. So in terms of quality of education, I think we did very well. I think one of the other things I'm proud of was that we really put our students' health and well-being at the forefront. So I'm an education expert, but I'm not a public health expert, and so we were very much relying on our public health officials to give us guidance for when it was safe and how it would be safe to bring our students back. And we brought them back as quickly as we were able to do that as well, because in person is best. So there are some things that I'm very proud of. You asked about financially. That was another huge challenge, because again, you're trying to plan for the unknown and not knowing how long are we going to be remote, how long are we going. There were a lot of questions in terms of funding. Would our funding be impacted because, for example, students weren't riding buses, and that can affect our transportation funding? So there were a lot of unknowns that we had to kind of plan for financially. And I'll be honest, it was pretty dark. It was pretty grim there for a while. And I am so very thankful to the federal government for sending that ESSER money, because we were facing some really tough choices, not necessarily last year, but for this fall, if it hadn't been for that ESSER money.
And how much did the district receive?
I want to say it was just over, you're going to ask me, and we've been parsing it out into different buckets. So, but it was, we were very fortunate. I think we were one of the highest districts in terms of locally in the area. I want to say it was 40 something, but I could be off. We also got it in 3 batches, right? So overall, I think it was 40 something.
And what exactly is the district's budget?
The district has about a $358-ish million budget, give or take $1 million.
And that's annual?
Yeah. Or that's this current year. Our current budget is right around 358.
Okay.
Best follow-up, Wendy, is so how are we going to assess the learning that was lost, and how are we going to help those students that lost the most during the pandemic?
That's a great question that we're still figuring out.
So
we are, yeah. I mean, obviously, we're just 7-8 weeks into the school year, so we're still figuring out where that learning loss happened, and we're doing a variety of different assessments to figure that out. in our district, we rely heavily on the iReady assessment, which assesses reading and math. But there are, of course, we talked about, that's not all of the skills that we teach. And so it's up to our different, our teachers in the different subject areas to determine. And I'll tell you, as a teacher in a different district, but as a teacher, I am definitely seeing some gaps that I never saw before. And so we are actively having those conversations. Okay, so where are those gaps? And then the next conversation is, how do you fill them, right? We also are doing, in fact, I think we just finished it last week. If I remember correctly, my daughter just finished it last week, the SBAC, which is the state test. And it was not given last year. So usually it's given in the spring. So this last couple of weeks, they were taking last year's test. But again, that'll give us kind of a big picture idea of where students are at. And then we'll take it again in the spring and we'll be able to compare those. But I will say that recovering the learning loss, I mean, that's not a simple thing. And it's not something that you can just do even in one school year. I mean, these are gaps that are going to take years to fill in. So that's going to be work that we're struggling with for several years.
And you mentioned that the school board has a lot of new members, and obviously your superintendent is new to Vancouver School District. He'd been there a few years ago, but he'd been more recently at Camas. So how do you assess your progress going forward? How do you know you're going in the right direction without that institutional memory?
Right. Well, one thing is that soliciting that feedback from the community. And that's something that this board has prioritized from the beginning. And I'll tell you that we were very frustrated by the pandemic because it really made it harder, right? We can't have those, well, we can now, but we couldn't have those public meetings for a long time. We still obviously had public comment. It was done remotely. And I think that that was definitely actually a kind of a silver lining because it made board meetings way more accessible than ever before. And we had more people tuning in and paying attention and signing up for public comment because they could do it from home. And that's something the board has chosen to continue with. Not all boards have. So we kind of do the hybrid school board meetings now where it's both available for people online at home and they can still give public comment remotely or they can come in person. But we had all kinds of plans for town halls and community forums, and they all got scrapped because of the pandemic. So now we're finally kind of in a place where we can start to do those things again. And we had to find some ways how to do them like remotely as well. And we did. We had some over the course of the last year and a half. But that community, you asked about how do we assess our progress. I mean, it's always from the community's feedback, right? The community is going to tell us when we're getting it right and when we're getting it wrong. They'll really tell us when we're getting it wrong. And that's why we have elections too, right? That's why I'm up for re-election this year. And if the community doesn't feel like we're going in the right direction, they'll let us know through the ballot box. The other thing that we do as a board with regards to the relationship between the board and the superintendent, with the new superintendent, we set up a completely different evaluation process, and we actually go through two evaluations every school year, or we will be starting this year. And we have met monthly with the superintendent to go over his goals and how he's doing and what are the next steps and provide him feedback. And so we're constantly having those conversations with the superintendent, and we are looking for opportunities always to have those conversations with the community at large.
And with the new superintendent, when Steve Webb agreed to early retirement, the board then approved a $455,000 payout. Is that good stewardship of taxpayer money?
In this case, it was, because it actually saved the district money over the long run. So Dr. Webb, his original plan was to still be here working for the district for this school year and mentoring the new superintendent, the incoming superintendent. And so the cost of the remaining, the combined cost of what was left on his contract last year and this year would have been higher than that number. So it actually did save the district some money in the long run. And I think that one of the things that the board felt very strongly about was that when we got into the superintendent search for the new superintendent, we had some really high quality candidates. We were so very fortunate to have a wonderful selection of superintendent candidates. And it was really clear that none of them were going to need mentoring. And so paying someone to stick around for another year to mentor someone who didn't really need it, that would not have been a good use of tax dollars.
But now you're paying him for not working with the district.
Well, we paid him an agreed amount for the remainder of his contract since he wasn't serving. But it would have been more if he had continued to work for the district to the end of this year. And his original plan was to retire at the end of this year.
Okay. Okay, great. Scott or Ben, anything specific? Craig, anything else?
No, I think I asked her all the questions I could think of, so I
Well,
tried to be tough.
Then give us your final pitch for why voters should support you.
I think that in order to be a good representative, you need to have a really deep connection to this community. And I do, as I said at the beginning, I've lived here my whole life. I'm a product of Vancouver Public Schools. But I think you also need to recognize and respect the values of the community. And I feel that I do that very well. I'm a strong believer in representative government, and I am just so fortunate and privileged to serve in this role. And I think the people elected me 4 years ago because they value the perspectives that I bring to the board, which is that of a parent, especially a parent of elementary students, which we hadn't had on the board for a really long time before I was elected. And also the perspective of an educator, someone who lives the reality of the classroom every day. I think that as a board director, some of the priorities that I have really pushed for is increased transparency. I very much have a hands-on, engaged sort of leadership style. And as a parent and as a teacher, my focus is always on this, always on the children, always on the students and their well-being and their success. And I'm sorry, did you ask? You wanted me to give you endorsements too?
Sure,
Okay.
Feel free.
So I have been endorsed by the Vancouver Education Association and the Vancouver Association of Education Support Professionals, which represent a large portion of our staff. I've been endorsed by the Southwest Washington Central Labor Council, as well as some other local labor unions, such as IBW and LIUNA, the firefighters. And I've also been endorsed by the National Women's Political Caucus and LULAC. I'm proud to say I have the support of all 4 of my fellow board directors.
Great. Well, Wendy, thank you very much. And again, I'm sorry Mr. Bailey couldn't join us, but we were pleased to have you. Best of luck.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.